first thing I noticed was his hands. He was sitting at the end of the hallway in Cedarview Lodge, the long-term care home on the east side of Kingston, and his hands were folded in his lap, like he was waiting for something that had stopped coming a long time ago. No television on, no book, no visitor tag clipped to the door. Just a man sitting in the low afternoon light of a November Wednesday, watching the parking lot like he was keeping track of every car that wasn't his son's. I was there to drop off a meal kit for my neighbor Paulette, who'd been recovering from hip surgery on the second floor. I almost didn't look twice, but something made me slow down as I passed his open door, and when I did, I saw the name printed on the whiteboard inside, small and slightly crooked, like whoever wrote it hadn't been paying much attention. Harold Finch? I don't know why that stopped me. Maybe it was the handwriting. Maybe it was the way the room looked. Technically furnished, but personally empty. The kind of space that said someone had arranged it for him rather than with him. A wool blanket folded too neatly over the arm of the chair. A framed photo of a lake turned at an angle that made it clear someone else had placed it there. I kept walking, got to Paulette's room, dropped off the containers, stayed for 20 minutes while she told me about her physiotherapy. And then on my way out, I stopped again in front of that door. He was still there. Same position, same stillness. My name is June, and I was 31 years old, 8 months out of a relationship that had ended quietly and badly, living in a one-bedroom apartment near the waterfront and working remotely as a technical writer for a software company in Ottawa. My life at that point was small and a little lonely in a way I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet. I had routines, I had my work, my Wednesday visits to Paulette, my Saturday farmer's market. I did not have a reason to walk into a stranger's room in a long-term care facility and introduce myself. I did it anyway. His name was Harold, and he was 79 years old, and he looked at me the way people look at something they're not sure is real. Cautious. Hopeful in a way that was almost painful to see. I said hello, asked if he minded company, and he gestured toward the chair across from him with a small formal nod, like I'd asked permission to sit in his actual home. It occurred to me later that that was exactly how he saw it. Even in that place, even in that room that wasn't really his, he had a host's dignity. We talked for 40 minutes. He told me about the lake in the photo, Loon Lake, up near Bancroft, where he'd had a cottage for 30 years. He told me about his wife, Eleanor, who died 4 years ago. He asked me what I did for work. And when I explained technical writing, he said, "So you make complicated things sound simple." I said I tried to. He said, "That's harder than people think." I left feeling better than I had in weeks. I told myself it was just a nice conversation. I came back the following Wednesday. And the Wednesday after that? By the third visit, the nurses knew my name. By the fifth, Harold had started leaving a second chair already angled toward his. He never said anything about it. It was just there when I arrived. He was sharp. That was the thing people seemed to have forgotten about him, or maybe never wanted to admit. He knew current events. He had opinions about the municipal election. He'd been reading a biography of Lester Pearson and wanted to argue about Canadian foreign policy in the 60s. Some days he was quieter, slower, and I could tell the tiredness went deep, the way it does when your body is working harder than anyone around you acknowledges. But he wasn't confused. He wasn't lost. He was just alone. I asked him once carefully whether his son visited much. He took a long moment before answering. "My son is busy," he said. "He has a lot going on." I recognized that sentence. It's the one people use when the truth is too complicated or too painful to say out loud. I didn't push. 2 weeks later, I arrived on a Thursday instead of a Wednesday. I'd had a deadline the day before and rescheduled without thinking much of it. As I came down the hallway, I heard voices from inside Harold's room. The door was halfway open. I didn't mean to stop and listen. I just did. A man's voice, flat and controlled. "Just initial here, Dad. It's routine." Harold's voice, quieter. "I don't understand what I'm signing." "It's just a formality for the property management." The property management. Harold had mentioned his house exactly once, about 6 weeks in passing. He'd bought it in 1987 in the East End, raised his son there, kept it up carefully for decades. When Eleanor died, he'd stayed. The house had a mortgage paid off in 2003, and Harold had told me, almost as an aside, that he'd been meaning to review his will. That phrase came back to me now, standing outside the door with my coat still on. I pushed it open. There were two of them inside. A man I'd never seen, mid-40s, good coat, the kind of face that knows how to arrange itself, and a woman standing slightly behind him with her arms crossed and her eyes on her phone. They both looked up. The man recovered first. He smiled at me like I was an inconvenience he was choosing to be gracious about. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to visit Harold," I said. Harold looked at me with something I can only describe as relief. The way you feel when someone you trust walks into a room where you've been uncomfortable. "This is my son," he said, "and my daughter-in-law." His son. I'll call him his son because that's what he was, even when he didn't act like it. Extended the hand and told me his name. He had the handshake of someone who learned it as a professional skill. He said he was glad his father had a friend who checked in. Said it with exactly the emphasis that made it clear he thought of me as something minor and temporary. I looked at the papers on the side table. "What are you signing?" I asked Harold, not his son. "Just updating some things," his son said. Before Harold could speak, Harold looked at the papers, then at his son, then at me. His jaw moved slightly. "I don't fully understand what it says," he said. "The language is technical." "I'm a technical writer," I said. "I can have a look." His son's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "I can explain it to him myself," he said. "We're in the middle of something." I smiled. "I have time." The silence in that room was the kind that is weight. His daughter-in-law looked up from her phone. His son picked up the papers and folded them once, neatly, and put them inside his jacket. "We'll come back another time," he said to Harold. Harold nodded slowly. He said okay in a voice that didn't mean okay. They left. I sat down in the chair across from Harold and neither of us spoke for almost a full minute. Then Harold said, without looking at me directly, "He's been coming more often lately." I asked him when it had started. "A few months ago," Harold said, "after I mentioned I might want to change my will." My stomach tightened. I kept my voice even. "Has he asked you to sign things before?" Harold was quiet for a moment. "Once." I said I wanted to read it first. He said there wasn't time. I asked him to leave it with me, and he said he'd forgotten it at home. I looked at the window. Outside, the parking lot was gray and half empty in the way Kingston gets in November. A Canada Goose was standing in the middle of the lot like it owned the place. "Do you have a lawyer?" I asked. Harold said he had. A man he'd used for the house sale in 2001, but he wasn't sure if he was still practicing. That night I went home and I didn't watch anything or do any of the things I usually do to avoid thinking. I just sat at my kitchen table and thought. I'd been a technical writer for 7 years. I knew exactly what it looked like when language was used to obscure rather than explain. A contract that takes 6 paragraphs to say something that should take 1 sentence is not accidentally complicated. It's deliberately complicated. It's written for someone who wants the other person to give up reading and just sign. And Harold had been right. He hadn't understood what it said. Because he wasn't supposed to. The next morning, I called a legal aid clinic in Kingston. I explained the situation without naming anyone, just the broad facts: elderly person in long-term care, adult child presenting documents for signature, person in question expressing confusion about what they're signing. The woman I spoke with was patient and thorough. She told me that in Ontario, any document signed by an individual whose capacity might be in question could be challenged under the Substitute Decisions Act. She told me about the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee. She told me what to look for, what to document, and who to call. I took notes for 2 hours. The following Wednesday, I came back to Harold with 2 things: a box of those butter tarts from the bakery on Princess Street that he'd mentioned liking, and a name. The name was a local lawyer who specialized in elder law, a woman who had an office on Brock Street, and a reputation, according to 3 separate online reviews, for not being intimidated by anyone. I didn't ask Harold's permission to contact her. I just told him what I'd found out, laid it out the way I'd learned to lay out technical information, clearly in plain language, without alarm in my voice, even when alarm was exactly what I felt. I told him he had options. I told him no one could make him sign anything. I told him that if he wanted help understanding what those papers actually said, there were people whose entire job was to help him with exactly that. Harold listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he looked at the butter tarts for a moment. He said, "I think I knew something was wrong, I just didn't know I was allowed to say so." That sentence has stayed with me. 3 days later, his son came back. I know because one of the nurses texted me. I'd given her my number a few weeks earlier for unrelated reasons, but she'd clearly been paying attention. And I drove over on a Tuesday afternoon without telling anyone I was coming. I heard him before I reached the door. Same controlled voice, same patient but not patient tone. "It's just your signature, Dad. It doesn't change anything that matters." I walked in. His son looked at me with something past surprise and into something closer to anger, though he managed it quickly. His wife was there again, by the window this time, and she gave me the particular look that women sometimes give each other when they've decided to be enemies. "You again," his son said. He didn't phrase it as a question. "Me again," I said. Harold was sitting with his hands in his lap, and I could see that whatever clarity had been in his face during our recent visits was being slowly pressed down by the stress of the room. That made me angrier than anything else. I said, "Harold, you don't have to sign anything today." His son said, "This is a private family conversation." I said, "Harold, would you like me to stay?" Harold said, "Yes, please." His son set the papers down on the side table and turned to face me fully. He was taller than me, and he clearly knew it. "I want to be very clear," he said, "that you have no legal standing here. You're not family. You're not his caregiver. You're just someone who showed up." "You're right," I said. "I'm just someone who showed up." I let that sit for a second. Then I said I also spoke to a lawyer, specifically about documents being presented to someone in long-term care without their lawyer present and without an independent assessment of capacity. The room changed. It didn't make a sound, but it changed the way air changes before a storm, that drop in pressure you feel before you can explain it. His daughter-in-law uncrossed her arms. His son said very carefully, "You spoke to a lawyer." "I did, and she's going to be reaching out to the administration here at Cedarview just to make sure the right protections are in place. Standard procedure, apparently, when there are concerns about financial elder abuse." The last two words landed exactly the way I intended them to. Financial, elder, abuse. In Ontario, that's not just a moral category, it's a legal one. His son picked up the papers from the side table. His jaw was tight. "This is not what you think it is." "Then you'll be able to explain it," I said, "to the lawyer, and to the public guardian's office if it comes to that." He looked at Harold. "Dad," he said, and his voice had changed, the control starting to show its seams. "You trust me." Harold was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought he might not speak at all. Then he said, "I trusted you to visit me. You stopped doing that 8 months ago." The words were mild. The effect was not. His son looked like he'd been handed something he didn't know what to do with. His daughter-in-law turned toward the window. "I'll be in touch," his son said. "To me, not Harold." He left. His wife followed without saying anything to either of us. Harold and I sat in the quiet for a while after that. The late afternoon light was doing that thing it does in November in eastern Ontario, coming in gold and flat and low, making everything look a little more significant than usual. He said after a while, "I have a lawyer." I had him write up some things, a few weeks ago actually, before all this started again. I looked at him. "Before I came here to Cedarview," he said, "I had a feeling. I didn't know exactly what was coming, but I had a feeling. So I made some changes." "What kind of changes?" I asked. He smiled slightly. "The kind that take the house out of the equation." I didn't fully understand what he meant then. I found out later. What followed over the next several weeks was not dramatic, not the way stories sometimes are. It was the slow work of systems being activated. The lawyer I'd contacted reached out to Cedarview's administration. Harold's file was flagged for additional oversight under the Residents' Bill of Rights. The public guardian's office sent a letter. I never saw it, but Harold mentioned it quietly with some satisfaction, and whatever his son had been trying to accomplish with those documents became significantly harder to accomplish. His son did not come back to the facility after that Tuesday, not for 3 weeks. When he did return, he came alone, without papers, without his wife, and he stayed for exactly 45 minutes. I know because a nurse told me afterward. She also told me that Harold had seemed calm throughout. The week before Christmas, I arrived on a Wednesday to find Harold sitting not by the window, but at the small table in the corner of his room with a cup of tea and what looked like a letter he'd just finished reading. He folded it when I came in, not hastily, just neatly, and set it beside his cup. He said, "I'd like to tell you something." I sat down. He said, "When Eleanor died, I changed my will. I left most things to my son. We weren't close the way I wanted us to be, but he was my son." And I thought, I don't know what I thought, that it might help, that it might mean something to him. I waited. He said, "After everything this fall, I had my lawyer make some more changes. I had him look very carefully at what my son was bringing me to sign. It turns out the documents would have transferred the deed to the house into a joint property trust that my son and his wife controlled. Effectively, they would have owned it, while I was still alive, without my knowledge of what I was agreeing to." His voice was steady. That was the most striking thing. Not angry, not trembling, just steady. The way someone sounds when they've had time to absorb something and have decided to be clear-eyed about it. I said, "I'm sorry." He said, "Don't be. I'm not anymore." He picked up the letter and held it for a moment. Then he looked at me with an expression I don't quite have words for. It was gratitude, but it was also something else, something more like recognition, the way you look at someone when you realize they've been actually present with you in a way you didn't fully register until it was over. He said, "I left the house to the Loon Lake Land Trust. There's an organization that protects lake properties up in the Bancroft area, keeps them from being developed. Eleanor and I always talked about it. We never got around to it while she was alive." I felt something happen in my throat that I managed to keep in place. He said, "And I set up a small fund for programming at this facility. Art classes, that sort of thing. I talked to the director. She was very receptive." He set the letter down. He said, "I wanted you to know. You didn't do this so that anything would happen for you. I know that. But I wanted you to know that something happened for me." I drove home that night through the empty streets of East Kingston with the heat on high and the radio off, and I thought about Harold in that chair by the window the first time I saw him, the stillness of a person who has stopped expecting anything. And I thought about the Canada Goose in the parking lot, standing in the middle of all that concrete like it had simply decided to be there, and that was enough. I came back the next Wednesday, and the one after that. 6 months later, Harold was transferred to a smaller care home closer to the waterfront, a newer place with better light and a common room with large windows that looked out over the St. Lawrence. His son contested the will through a lawyer, but the challenge went nowhere. Harold's capacity had been formally assessed twice by that point, and the documentation was clean. The land trust received the house in the spring. The fundraising director at Cedarview told me the art program was oversubscribed by March. I still visit Harold on Wednesdays. He still has the photograph of Loon Lake. We argue about Canadian history, and he still wins more often than not. Some days he's tired and we just sit, and that's fine too. Last week he told me Eleanor would have liked me. He said it simply, the way he says most things. Like the words have been considered long enough that they don't need decoration. I said I was sure I would have liked her too. He nodded. "Yes," he said, "I imagine you would have." I keep thinking about that first Wednesday, standing in the hallway of Cedarview Lodge with a meal kit in my hands and absolutely no reason to slow down. Nothing obligated me to stop. Harold wasn't my family. He wasn't my responsibility. He was just a name on a crooked whiteboard and a man in a chair who had gotten very good at waiting for people who weren't coming. And yet, I think about what would have happened if I'd kept walking. Harold would have sat with those papers eventually. His son would have kept coming back, patient and persistent the way people are when there's a property deed involved, and at some point the exhaustion of resisting, the confusion, the loneliness, the pressure of someone who is supposed to love you telling you it's just routine, would have been enough. That's how it works. Not always through force, often just through wearing someone down until they stop questioning. What stopped that wasn't luck. It was a choice and then another choice and then the slow accumulation of showing up until Harold understood that someone was genuinely there. That's the part I want to be clear about. Because I think we misunderstand how care actually operates. It's not one dramatic moment, it's the second Wednesday, and the third. It's the chair already angled toward yours when you arrive. It's the butter tarts from the bakery on Princess Street because he mentioned once, in passing, that he liked them. Harold was not a passive person waiting to be rescued. He'd already been to his lawyer. He'd already made changes to his will before I ever walked through that door. What he needed wasn't someone to act on his behalf. He was fully capable of that himself. What he needed was someone who made him feel like his judgment was worth trusting again. Like the fog his son had been carefully cultivating around him. The you won't even remember this tomorrow. The you don't need to understand. Like that fog wasn't actually who he was. That's what I think about when people talk about doing the right thing as if it's simple. It's not always simple. It cost me Tuesday afternoons and a certain amount of anxiety, and one very uncomfortable conversation in a small room with a man who was used to being the most confident person present. Integrity isn't easy when the other person is calm and well-dressed and telling you very politely that you have no legal standing here. You have to have done enough thinking in advance to know what you believe and why, so that when the moment comes, you're not scrambling. And then you have to stay. That's the part nobody talks about. Knowing what's right is one thing. Staying in the room after you've said it out loud is another. Harold gave that house to a land trust because he and Eleanor had talked about it for 30 years and never gotten around to it. His son wanted it for the money. Harold wanted it to mean something. That difference between what we take and what we leave behind. That's the whole story, isn't it? That's the thing we're thinking about long after the paperwork is done and the legal challenges go nowhere and the art program at Cedarview fills up by March. I still visit on Wednesdays. He still wins most of our arguments about Canadian history. Some days that's enough. Most days it's more than enough.